You destroyed our homes. The words hit before the morning coffee cooled. She stood at the edge of my land, pointing at a roofline that hadn't shed a single shingle during the storm, fury running ahead of the facts. At first I thought shock had taken hold. Then a lawyer arrived. Then an envelope. Then a formal demand for $15 million tied to federal disaster recovery funds. The allegation was astonishing in its simplicity. My house, engineered and maintained to stand its ground through hurricanes, had somehow deflected wind into the neighboring subdivision and caused their destruction. I don't live in their HOA. I don't pay their dues or follow their bylaws. I'm not even in their zip code. None of that slowed the push to make me responsible for what happened inside their boundaries. This is an account of that case, told plainly and directly, with documentation at every turn. If you are a homeowner in hurricane country, a member of an association, a contractor, or anyone who follows property rights, insurance disputes, and disaster recovery, the sequence matters. The facts, the timing, the records, the meteorology, the construction history, the money trail, the mediation, and the arbitration all point in one direction. My hope is that this report gives clarity to anyone who might one day find themselves on the receiving end of a similar claim, and a reminder that careful preparation before a storm can protect you long after the winds have faded. The morning after the hurricane, I stepped onto the porch of a house that has been tested by time. My property sits on a gentle rise just beyond the boundary of the Pine Ridge HOA. From that vantage, I could see the subdivision to the northeast. Even at a distance, the damage was undeniable. Roofs peeled back, walls fractured, debris scattered across yards as if a giant hand had shaken a snow globe filled with broken furniture. Blue tarps were already appearing. In contrast, my own home was intact. The raised foundation design my grandfather used in 1962 performed the way it had been meant to perform. The sabal palms he planted as a living windbreak bent with the gusts and released them. The hurricane shutters, rated for Category 5 conditions, locked and held. You could see the difference between 60 years of engineering and 20 years of developer profit margins from 300 meters away. I did what decades in the field had taught me to do. I documented. I walked the fence line and watched the sand surface where wind had written its record. The ripples carried one direction, southwest to northeast, parallel lines undisturbed except for deer tracks. I filmed a slow pan across the property and followed with still photos of the sand patterns and the trees, noting scars where branches had thrashed against trunks. My land faces the direction the wind came from, and the subdivision sits downwind. It is basic geography the way you learn it when you're a kid and confirm it later with a compass. Wind does not switch directions because it crosses an engineered structure. It does not pinball into a neighborhood because a neighbor planted palms. By mid-morning, a sedan rolled up the long drive. A woman in business attire introduced herself as Lydia Navarro, president of Pine Ridge HOA. A man in a suit, their attorney, stood just behind her. She asked if we could speak inside. I declined and stayed on the steps. Her tone was measured but direct. She told me their preliminary engineering analysis suggested that my property's elevation and vegetation had contributed to wind deflection patterns that intensified damage in their community. I asked her plainly if she was blaming my house for her residents' losses. The attorney spoke instead. He said they planned to pursue a civil claim for $15 million and apply for federal disaster programs tied to man-made exacerbation of storm damage. He said they were offering me a chance to cooperate and then left the phrase unfinished. Or we proceed with compulsory legal action, he added, handing me a thick envelope. I was being served. I didn't rush to open it. I called a mobile notary and had her time-stamp the sealed envelope before I broke it. Documentation is not just a good habit after a hurricane, it is a shield. She logged it, stamped it, and left. Inside, the civil complaint named my home as a contributing cause of catastrophic damage to Pine Ridge through structural configuration and wind deflection. The demand was $15 million. I sat there a long minute letting it sink in. They were actually suing a property outside their boundary for withstanding a storm within its design. That evening, a message in thick marker was taped to my mailbox, positioned beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. You destroyed our homes. You will pay. I took a photo and stored it in the folder that had already begun forming in my mind. 2 days later, a text from an unknown number arrived. It informed me that the Pine Ridge HOA would be discussing my name at their community meeting that evening at 7, and it was signed by a concerned resident. I debated whether to go. I wasn't a member, and they were not obligated to let me in. But if my name was going to be discussed in a room filled with people who had just suffered severe hurricane damage and were being pointed at me, I needed to hear the claims directly. The Pine Ridge Community Center was crowded, the parking lot full. About 30 residents sat facing a screen. When I entered, the room turned as one. Lydia was at the podium and paused when she saw me. She reminded me I was not a member. I told her I was the person their lawyer had just sued for $15 million, and I had a right to hear what was being said. After a brief silence, she allowed me to observe but not speak. She advanced to a slide labeled Wind Damage Analysis and Recovery Funding Pathway. Her presentation centered on a federal disaster recovery program that, she said, releases money if a community proves man-made exacerbation of storm damage. An aerial image showed my property circled in red, the Pine Ridge subdivision outlined in blue, and an arrow illustrating wind direction. Then she said a sentence that would reshape the case. When we planned this assessment before the storm, she corrected herself midstream and kept going, but the words were clear. I was recording audio under the table. The implication was hard to miss. The plan to attribute damage to a neighboring property existed before the hurricane made landfall. Residents asked how the HOA could sue someone who does not belong to the association. Lydia's answer leaned on civil tort law and made one point repeatedly. If causation is proven, the HOA could access $15 million for repairs and legal costs. The incentive was no longer beneath the surface. I returned to the public sidewalk along the worst damaged row in Pine Ridge with a camera and methodically photographed the connection points where hurricane panels were supposed to latch into brackets. The metal told a story that didn't match the HOA's narrative. If hurricane winds had torn panels off, the brackets would show stress deformation, torn screw holes, bent lips, and abrasion marks. Instead they were smooth, scuff-free, and, in many cases, looked unused. The panels were not ripped off by wind. The panels had not been fastened before the storm. The next morning, the city building inspector met me there, examined the brackets, and recorded his findings. He captured high-resolution images and filed an official report noting the absence of stress deformation that would be expected if panels had been forcibly removed by high wind. He said he would flag the inconsistency in the damage pattern. It was a neutral report, and that mattered. At the same time, I took a screenshot of the HOA's CFD analysis, slide to a print shop owned by a forensic specialist. Under UV light, he showed me a matrix of tiny yellow microdots, printer signatures used by many commercial devices to encode timestamps and serial information on printed pages. He told me the pattern was consistent with an Epson Sure Color series and asked for time to narrow the serial batch. A week later he called to report a strong match to a batch starting with J72. If the engineering report had been legitimately produced, we would expect to see a licensed engineer's stamp, metadata, and a chain of custody. What we were seeing looked like a home-printed graphic. I also reached out to a professor of fluid mechanics with a copy of the slide. He replied with a detailed analysis that pointed out inverted wind vectors, pressure units that did not reflect any standard in computational fluid dynamics, and a color gradient inconsistent with recognized conventions. He concluded the image appeared to be a modified template rather than an original model. He agreed to provide a sworn statement if needed. Back on my land, the trees and soil continued to tell the same story they had told on day one. A compass set at the base of a large oak pointed true while a scrape ran from 7 feet down to 3 along the northeast face of the trunk where wind had driven branches during the storm. Sap had dried along the scar. 3 other trees showed the same northeast-facing marks. The wind direction was fixed in place by nature. A licensed ham radio operator in the neighborhood, part of the storm spotter network and the husband of the treasurer, had logged the storm as it passed with the precision of a metronome. He recorded sustained winds around 55 knots with gusts into the low 70s, all flowing from the southwest to the northeast, in 15-minute increments submitted to the National Weather Service. Those logs had already been accepted into the official record. There was also the matter of Summit Property Services, the company whose name appeared on the shirts in the photo of workers removing connectors. Summit was tied to the developer as an in-house maintenance arm. Under the Sunshine Law request I had filed earlier, records showed the HOA paid Summit 1 day before landfall for hurricane preparation. The work order specified tasks that included the removal of protective panels. On the ground, The empty, unscuffed brackets corroborated that story better than any slideshow ever could. While I was assembling this material into a coherent file, the claim against me escalated. A certified letter announced an amended civil complaint increasing the demand from $15 million to $20 million and adding punitive damages for what the filing called willful and wanton disregard for community safety through grossly negligent property maintenance. The scale had changed, but the evidence had not. If anything, every increase in pressure underscored the gap between the accusation and the facts. Rebecca reached out and asked to meet off HOA property. At a coffee shop in the next town over, she admitted she had been the one to drop the USB drive. She opened her laptop and showed me a cached page from the Coastal Claims Recovery website that had since been removed, but the Internet Archive had preserved a snapshot listing a case that matched Pine Ridge before the hurricane hit. She played a news clip of Lydia at a podium saying, "We began preparing documentation weeks before landfall," followed by a quick correction. The clip had aired live. There were no edits. Then she opened the spreadsheet that mattered most. It recorded payments. An initial $25,000 retainer paid by the HOA to Coastal Claims Recovery 2 weeks before landfall and a contract establishing a 25% success fee on any recovered funds. At $15 million, that success fee would be $3.75 million. Ownership records tied Coastal Claims Recovery in part to James Navarro, Lydia's brother-in-law by marriage, with a 30% stake. None of that had been disclosed in the civil complaint filed against me. She told me that the board had voted 4-1 to escalate the damages to $20 million and bring in a second expert, a wind engineering consultant named Dr. Richard Morrison, known for testifying in favor of HOAs and insurance companies. She was the lone vote against. She also confirmed that her husband, the ham radio operator, was willing to testify to the meteorological record. The science of the storm did not support the HOA's claim. Soon after, the county clerk called to say my sunshine request was ready for pickup. The packet included 73 pages of emails, invoices, meeting minutes, and receipts. There were exchanges between Lydia and Coastal Claims about the plan before landfall. There was the invoice for core sampling equipment ordered days before the storm. There was a receipt for Epson printer ink delivered to Lydia's home. There were minutes with no mention of conflict disclosures. There was a signed contract with Coastal Claims with a 25% success fee. It was the skeleton of the case laid bare in public record. A certified notice of mandatory mediation arrived, as required by state law before arbitration. 14 days. I laid out everything on my dining table: photos of sand patterns, images of tree scarring and compass readings, the inspector's reports, the ham radio logs, the sunshine law emails, the retainer agreement, the business registration showing family ties, the forensic printing analysis, and the professor's statement on the CFD slide. It was a complete set, organized to show what had happened in time. The mediation room was neutral, but the stakes were not. The mediator opened by asking the HOA to present its position. Lydia said Pine Ridge suffered catastrophic hurricane damage, and that internal analysis pointed to my property's elevated position and dense vegetation acting as a windbreak that redirected winds into the subdivision. She linked that claim to eligibility for disaster recovery funds that require proof of third-party causation. I told the mediator this claim was fraudulent, that my property sits outside the HOA, that my house stood because it was engineered and maintained properly, and that the pattern of damage in Pine Ridge was consistent with construction defects and a decision to remove storm protection before landfall. I noted that the recovery plan channeled a quarter of any award to a firm connected to the HOA president's family, a fact absent from their complaint. Their lawyer called their expert. Dr. Morrison described a scenario in which my land and palm grove accelerated winds into the neighborhood. My attorney handed him a document showing that he had testified in 11 causation cases over 3 years, all for HOAs or insurance interests, and that his methods had been challenged multiple times. When asked about compensation for this case, he admitted to a $50,000 retainer plus 15% of any recovered damages. The mediator wrote it down. Compensation structures affect how expert testimony is weighed. The mediator then asked Lydia for the name and license number of the engineer whose seal appeared on their computational fluid dynamics report. The answer did not come. Their attorney said a vendor had used modeling software. The mediator pressed for a licensed engineer and a stamp number. Silence followed. No licensed professional had signed off on the report. The mediator turned to conflict disclosures and asked whether the connection between the HOA president and the recovery firm had been disclosed in the complaint. It had not. The mediator paused the session. He gave the HOA 5 business days to provide a certified engineer's identity and seal, a written conflict disclosure filed with the court, and an authentication of the wind analysis methodology. Until those items were received, mediation was suspended. In the hallway, the HOA attorney approached and suggested a quick settlement. He said I would spend more than $100,000 fighting this, that they would settle for $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement, and that the case would disappear quietly. I told him I would not pay for a claim built on falsehoods and would not sign an agreement that kept the truth out of view. Because the required documentation did not arrive, the case moved to binding arbitration before a retired judge, with a court reporter and a county observer present. There would be no appeal. It was final. The HOA's attorney asked for a ruling that my property caused wind deflection damage that would allow them to pursue federal recovery funds. He said any missing paperwork was due to vendor errors. Lydia testified they acted in good faith. The arbitrator did not let the filing pass on vague assurances. He reminded Lydia that she had signed the complaint and bore responsibility for its accuracy. Then he let the record do what it was designed to do. My counsel presented the case in a sequence that reflected the order of evidence, not rhetoric. Elevation and geography showed a gentle 20-foot drop over roughly a third of a kilometer from my property toward Pine Ridge. That slope affects drainage, not wind deflection. Aerial images placed the properties and the path of the storm clearly. The physical evidence on my land, tree scars, sap trails, sand ripples, and compass readings, aligned with official ham radio logs submitted to the National Weather Service documenting sustained southwest to northeast winds. Construction history underscored the difference between my house's inspections and certifications and Pine Ridge's code violations and variances. Storm protection decisions were documented by a photo taken the day before the storm showing workers removing connectors, invoices showing payment for hurricane preparation that included removal, and an inspection report showing unused brackets after the storm. The computational fluid dynamics slide was traced to a consumer printer through microdot analysis and was debunked by a professor's written statement on its inverted vectors and incorrect units. Premeditation was established by emails, invoices, and a publicly archived website listing, all dated before landfall, and a financial motive was documented by a retainer and a success fee awarded to a firm connected to the HOA president's family, none of which was disclosed in the civil complaint. The arbitrator read the ruling aloud. The evidence, he said, overwhelmingly showed bad faith. He found that I reside outside the HOA on property engineered and maintained to withstand hurricanes, that the physical and meteorological record disproved the alleged wind deflection, that storm protection was knowingly removed before landfall, that the CFD presentation was fabricated, that plans to build a third-party causation narrative were set in motion before the hurricane, and that financial interests were concealed from the court. He dismissed the case with prejudice. He ordered the HOA and Lydia Navarro to pay my legal costs. He referred the matter to state prosecutors for potential fraud charges and to building authorities for negligence. He required the HOA to issue a full retraction within 48 hours. He barred Lydia from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. The room emptied without theatrics. There was a quiet that follows only when the facts have finally been allowed to stand. A house built honestly did what it was meant to do. It outlasted wind. It outlasted rumor. It outlasted a claim designed to unlock money the old-fashioned way, by pointing the finger somewhere else. For anyone following along from the outside, a few themes are worth stating clearly, because they matter in every hurricane season and every HOA lawsuit. Documentation matters. Begin the moment the storm passes, or even before if you can. Photograph the sand, the trees, the brackets, the panels, the bolts, the license plates of contractors. Keep receipts for shutters and anchor systems. Save emails. Use a notary when it counts. Chain of custody is not a phrase for lawyers alone. It is a practical tool for anyone who wants truth to stand when challenged. Public records matter. In Florida, the Sunshine Law is not a technicality. It's a light switch. It exposes emails and contracts and invoices that people might otherwise hope will stay in private folders. When disaster recovery funds are at stake, those records often show what words in a press release will not. Neutral professionals matter. A city inspector documented what brackets should look like if panels had been torn off and what they actually looked like in Pine Ridge. A forensic printing expert used microdot analysis to trace the origin of a supposed engineering slide. A professor of fluid mechanics laid out line by line why the model was not a model at all. A ham radio operator logged the storm's behavior every 15 minutes and submitted the log to the National Weather Service. Each of them stood outside the accusations and looked at the evidence as it was, not as someone wanted it to be. Conflicts of interest matter. Disaster recovery is meant to help communities rebuild, not to enrich insiders who structure success fees around manufactured blame. If a firm stands to gain a percentage of a multimillion-dollar award and its principal is connected to the person signing the complaint, that relationship belongs in the public record from day one. Courts notice when it is not. And finally, good construction matters. It is not glamorous to talk about raised foundations and properly rated shutters and heritage windbreaks when the sun shines and the air is calm. It can sound like overkill to insist on engineering that accounts for the worst day rather than the best one. But when a hurricane comes ashore and accelerates across a county, those decisions are no longer line items. They are the difference between repair and ruin. When the arbitrator closed the file and the court reporter stopped typing, I went home and looked at the marks on the oak and the palm fronds that had thinned and rebalanced themselves after the storm. I thought about my grandfather in 1962, deciding to plant palms where they would bend and not break, raising a foundation a little higher, choosing shutters meant for winds that had not yet arrived. He wasn't thinking about civil complaints or federal recovery funds. He was thinking about what a storm does to a house and what a house can do in return. He gave me a blueprint to follow. In the end, that blueprint stood up not just to the weather, but to a narrative that tried to make physics into fiction. If you have been through something similar, a claim that never made sense, pressure to sign a quiet settlement, a parade of experts with the same conclusions and the same clients, I would like to hear what you faced and how you navigated it. If you were sitting in my chair, served with a $20 million demand for doing nothing more than building and maintaining a home that holds, would you have settled or taken it all the way to arbitration? Share your perspective. And if you know someone in the middle of an HOA lawsuit or a hurricane damage claim that doesn't match the weather record, pass this along. Accuracy is not just for courtrooms. It is for neighbors. Thanks for listening and for caring about the kind of details that keep communities honest. Hurricane season will come again. Preparation is not panic. It is respect for the wind, for the work, and for the people whose lives drift into the headlines when the rain stops and the stories begin.